welcome to the International Alliance for Phytobiomes Research webinar series. My name is Dusty Gallagher. I'm the Executive Director of the Phytobiomes Alliance, and we are excited that you're with us today because we have a very interesting topic to explore and a great presenter and presentation for you today. To begin, I would just like to share a few slides about the Phytobiomes Alliance. And starting, I would like to first thank the sponsors of the Phytobiomes Alliance because it is with their support that we're able to do what we do, and especially this webinar series, providing you the interesting systems-based research for the community, and their sponsorship is just greatly appreciated. So thank you to all of our sponsors. And just a bit about the Phytobiomes Alliance. We are a nonprofit consortium of industry, academia, and we also work with government scientists. And our vision, created by our board of directors, is that by 2050, all farmers will have the ability to use the necessary data and analytics based on geophysical and biological conditions to help them determine the best combination of plants, substrates, management practices, and inputs for a specific field in a given year. And so when we refer to the phytobiomes, it's something more complex than when we refer to a microbiome. The phytobiome is the complex system of plant-based agriculture that includes the substrate, the plants grown in that substrate, and then all of the interactions that take place below and above the ground in the soil with the microbiomes and the microorganisms, arthropods, other animals and plants. Then we also have the climate, weather, and water that interacts as well. And then all of this is influenced by management practices. So this whole entire system is what we're focused on with the phytobiomes. So we also have upcoming webinars that I would like to introduce to you today. Our next one will be March 25th. And then we'll also have one on April 22nd. Those webinars and registration for those webinars is already available. So please sign up to attend those webinars as well. And we also have a mailing list. If you're not already on that mailing list, that link to join is at the bottom of the screen and will also be posted in the chat for you. So make sure to check out these upcoming webinars. And we're very excited to announce that our International Phytobiomes Conference that we hold every 2 years has recently been announced. So we'd like for you to save the date, November 3rd through the 5th, and we will be at Niagara-on-the-Lake in Ontario, Canada. And so please mark your calendars. More information and registration will be out very soon. But this is a great opportunity to network with the community and hear the latest science that's happening within our phytobiome community. So just a few announcements about our webinar today. It will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel later today. And after the presentation, there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session. And the way to submit your questions is in the questions panel. That is different from the chat. And the chat panel has been disabled for participants. So the purpose of the chat will be for the organizers of this webinar to share information for you today. So be sure to check out that Q&A panel, familiarize yourself with it, and please use that that questions panel to ask your questions. There's also a handouts panel in which we will be sharing information from the presentation today. So just so you'll know where all of the information and how you can interact with the speaker today. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Sabrina Cohen. She's a doctorate student and a research assistant at Colorado State University, and she will be discussing climate futures, Earth system models, and crop productivity. So, welcome, Sabrina. We appreciate you being here, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Dusty. I'm going to share my screen. Um, I apologize. Hold on. Let me try one more thing. Having a little bit of technical difficulty. Hold on one second. Going to share one more time. There we are. All right. I'm hoping
And
that everyone
it looks
can.
good, Sabrina. So, you're
Awesome.
ready
And
to go.
everyone can hear me. All right. Perfect. All right. I'm going to begin now. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the Alliance for inviting me. It's a real honor for me to come and share work that I did. This is my master's research. I'm currently in my first year as a PhD student in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. So I will clarify, I am not a plant scientist. I'm in atmospheric science. But the reason that I was invited is to discuss climate futures, Earth system models, and crop productivity. So basically, what I'll be doing is I'll be talking about possible crop productivity under various climate futures in a more interdisciplinary and a more holistic, high-level sense. So thank you so much for inviting me. All right. So in my slides, and the slides will be shared if you'd like to look at them afterwards. But in my slides, you'll see that at the top, generally, I put titles, I put sentences, and these sentences are the big takeaway ideas that I'd like you to remember after this talk. So they're the most important ideas. All right, so let's begin. The first most important idea, I'm sure that you're all aware, that the adverse impacts of climate change due to the combustion of fossil fuels are accelerating. So CO2, atmospheric CO2 levels and global mean temperatures are rising at an accelerating rate. Here you can see a graph of the global mean temperature from 1850 to 2025, and you'll see that on the y-axis here is the global temperature anomaly. So basically, how the global mean temperature for a given year compared to the 1850 to 1900 average. And so you can see that from one year to the next, there's a lot of variability because in the climate system there's natural variability, but you can see a clear upward trend. And then you can also see that in the last 3 years, from 2023 to 2025, were by far the three highest years on record in terms of global mean temperature. And of course, um, the impacts of climate change are not limited to temperature rise alone, although heat waves are a significant factor, are a significant consequence of climate change. But we also have various other adverse impacts, such as wildfires, crop failures, floods, extreme weather. And so, in this situation, obviously, the most important remedy to this increasingly grave problem is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing fossil fuel combustion. And the world is on that path. But more and more scientists are concerned that even though the world is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we can't do so in a way that's fast enough to sufficiently reduce the impacts, such as those that are presented here. Um, we can't act fast enough. So, in that sense, more and more scientists in the past decades have been considering possible other techniques that can be used in conjunction. So, at the same time that the world continues to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there are other possibilities that could be implemented but require significant research. And that possibility that I'll be discussing with you today is called stratospheric aerosol injection. Now, um, I don't really like to use a bunch of acronyms when I speak, but in this case, this is one acronym that I'd like you to remember throughout the talk. I will say SAI for short, stratospheric aerosol injection. Stratospheric aerosol injection, the idea is to use airplanes to launch a bunch of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. So the stratosphere is the a fairly high portion of the atmosphere. And in that way, little sulfate aerosols will be formed that will reflect incoming sunlight and therefore cool the planet. And the idea of stratospheric aerosol injection has a natural analog because, for example, occasionally there are large volcanic eruptions. And so that causes a bunch of aerosols to form and to stay in the stratosphere for a couple years. And it's been seen that when that happens, global temperatures are effectively cooled for a couple years. So it does have a natural analog. However, natural analogs are quite different from the type of injection that is proposed to be done. So therefore, there's a great need for research to understand what are the possible benefits and what are the possible risks of using SAI to reduce the adverse impacts of global warming, of climate change. All right. So in this sense, um, because direct experiment, we only have one Earth. And so direct experiment of seeing how stratospheric aerosol injection would affect the climate is not permitted. So therefore, Earth system models have a huge role to play in understanding how SAI could potentially impact climate from a very holistic perspective. All right, so in a very in a very simple sense, Earth system models, what they do is they divide the world into grid boxes. These grid boxes, in the past couple decades, as computers have been getting stronger and stronger and more powerful, the grid boxes have been getting smaller and smaller. Um, in the latest generation of these Earth system models, the grid boxes are still fairly large. They're about 100 to 200 kilometers by 100 to 200 kilometers. So from looking at very small, for example, an individual storm, they're not sufficient, but from understanding the climate, they're quite powerful tools. So basically, what these Earth system models do, they're based in physics. They solve physical equations based on, for example, the conservation of momentum, the conservation of mass, and the crucial element here is that the models are coupled. What does that mean? That means that there's interaction between the atmosphere, the ocean, the ice sheets, the land, because these different Earth system components that we can't analyze, for example, when we're looking at climate, even though I'm in the Department of Atmospheric Science, to understand how the climate evolves, we have to understand how the different Earth system components interact with each other because there's constant fluxes of, for example, energy, water, different gases, carbon, nitrogen, etc. So these Earth system models incorporate these different interactions between the different Earth system components. So they are very powerful tools. I think it's also important to keep in mind that they do have their limitations. For example, as I was saying before, for example, if you wanted to look at the evolution of an individual storm, that's a couple kilometers in scale, there's no way to do that with an Earth system model that's 100 kilometers in scale. And so these Earth system models, they incorporate parameterizations, which basically are empirical formulas that don't directly model, for example, what's going on in clouds, cloud microphysics, that sort of thing, which are definitely important to understanding climate. Climate models and Earth system models are also biased. For example, the Earth system model that I'm going to be talking about today, it has a warm bias in the summer season. So it's important to keep that into account that there are bias, and also they are very computationally expensive to run. With those limitations in mind, though, they are an extremely powerful tool. And in the case of looking at something like climate futures and SAI, they are an extremely important tool to understand the effect of climate futures on the Earth system. All right. So, with that introduction in mind, I'm going to be presenting the particular Earth system model that I used for my study. It's the Community Earth System Model version 2. It's produced by the USA National Center of Atmospheric Research. And its current grid box resolution is zero point 0.9 degrees latitude by 1.25 degrees longitude. That's roughly 100 kilometers in scale. And critically, when we're looking at something like SAI, it's vertically layered up to about 140 kilometers in height in the atmosphere. And so it can model sulfate aerosol processes. All right. And particularly the land model. So the Earth system model requires a lot of different models for the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, etc. The land model that's used by this model is the Community Land Model version 5. So this model is quite advanced compared to previous versions and compared to many Earth system models. This is a state-of-the-art climate model. And so it simulates the growth of major crops. For example, it simulates corn, wheat, rice, soybean, cotton, switchgrass. There might be one or two more that I'm forgetting, but the major crops. It doesn't simulate many other crops, barley, cassava, etc. It also incorporates technological advancements such as fertilization and irrigation. So the different crop types that I just mentioned, generally are split into two categories. So rain-fed, for example, rain-fed maize and irrigated maize. Um, However, biases are also present. So, for example, this paper, Lombardozzi et al., 2020, and by the way, I'm not sharing too many links. There are many papers that have been written about simulated agriculture and agriculture under SAI, but I'm sharing a few links in the presentation that will be shared with you via the chat in this webinar. But anyway, Lombardozzi et al. In 2020, this paper documents it compares the simulated agriculture in this model compared to actual agricultural outputs. And there are some biases present depending on the crop, but overall, there's quite good comparison. All right, so that's a little introduction about the model. All right, so the next major idea that I have at the top here is no one climate change or SAI scenario exists. So when we're talking about climate change or SAI or different climate futures, we have to keep in mind that there can be different levels of greenhouse gas emissions, different levels of temperature. For example, in the case of SAI here, we can start injecting into the stratosphere at different dates. We can inject for different periods of time. The amount of sulfate aerosol we inject into the atmosphere can be different. So for example, if we want to cool the planet more, we can inject more sulfate aerosol, etc. All right. So I'm in the slides that you'll see that are forthcoming. I'm comparing everything to a base period. So the base period is roughly the present period. It's the years 2020 to 2039. For the purpose of this talk, don't worry too much. You'll see in the figures that I present, you'll see this term SSP245. Basically, what that means is just considering, because, for example, climate scientists can consider very extreme um, greenhouse gas emission scenarios or some scenarios that in which the world decides to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This scenario, SSP245, is basically an intermediate scenario where we more or less continue on the path of greenhouse gas emissions that we are on currently. So that's what that means. The climate change scenario is the period from 2050 to 2069. So we can imagine, okay, if we continue with the greenhouse gas emission path that we are on currently, what will the climate look like in 2050 to 2069 on average? So the average of those 20 years. And then in this paper and the study that I did, I looked at 3 different SAI scenarios. So the first scenario is SAI 1.5. It starts in 2035 and the injection of sulfate aerosol runs through 2069. And the idea of SAI 1.5 is to maintain global temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, because about 10, 12 years ago, there was an agreement, the Paris Agreement, which determined that if global warming were limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that would be optimal for the planet. The next scenario I considered was SAI delayed. So in its name, it says delayed. That's because the idea is that injection doesn't start until 2045, and the temperature target is roughly the same, 1.37 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And then the final scenario is SAI 1.0, which the idea of SAI 1.0 is injecting more sulfate aerosol so that the planet can be cooled down to 1 degree, only 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial. So we can see that by incorporating these different scenarios, we can compare a range of possible futures. All right, so my study is a regional study. I'll get to that in just a minute, but I'm going to present here two global figures because, as I've mentioned, to understand my results, it's important to kind of take a global perspective. So I'm going to explain very simply. So if you're not an atmospheric science, as an atmospheric scientist, no worries at all. All right, but the big idea here is that projected temperature changes under these different climate futures are global, while precipitation changes are regional. All right, so we see here, so if you look here at the top left, so we see this is the climate change scenario. We see, and the dash here indicates that there's a statistically significant change. So the dashed lines, the diagonal lines. So we can see that under the climate change scenario, we can see that annual surface temperature increases by several degrees Celsius compared to the present day, more or less, 2020 to 2039. And we can see that, for example, in if we go to panel B here, in SAI 1.5, we can see that temperatures more or less stay the same in the 2050 to 2069 period relative to the present day. We can see more or less the similar case in SAI delayed. And then in SAI 1.0, we can see that the temperatures are actually cooled. Several decades from now, they're projected to be cooled relative to the present day. All right. So we can see that for each of the scenarios, for each of the four figures, we can see that the changes, there's a little regional variability, but mostly we can see that, for example, if we look at panel A here, under climate change, temperature is warm, as we would expect, and under the most extreme SAI cooling scenario, temperature is cool. Okay, but we can see that for precipitation, there's more regional variability. So at a very simple level, let's look here at the climate change scenario, the panel A in the top left here. We can see, so the blue here, the blue-green here indicates that there's more projected to be more precipitation under climate change in this equatorial region. And so very simply, at the equator, right, there's a lot of incoming solar energy and there's a lot of moisture. So that causes warm air to rise and condense. And so that causes a lot of precipitation. But we can also see a little higher, so this is the subtropics. I hope you can see my mouse. So a little bit above the equator, we can see that there's drying, so projected drying, so less precipitation under climate change. And that's basically a consequence of conservation of mass. So if there's more rising air at the equator, that means there's less rising air. Rising air is associated with precipitation. So that means there's less rising air in the subtropics. All right. And to simplify things, I'm just going to go directly to panel D here, which is SAI 1.0. So that's the most extreme. So basically, there's a lot of different plots on my figures here, but if you had to just kind of very simply look at the plots to get the big picture, I suggest comparing the climate change scenario, which is this SSP245, with the extreme cooling scenario. So basically comparing the extreme warming scenario with the extreme or the most significant cooling scenario. So if we compare panel A and panel D, we can see that the effects are basically flipped. So we can see, for example, in the climate change scenario, we can see an increase in precipitation at the equator. But here in the most extreme SAI cooling scenario, we can see a decrease in precipitation at the equator. And basically, that's because if we use stratospheric aerosol injection to reduce incoming solar radiation, that means there's going to be less energy coming to the equator, there's going to be less rising air, less precipitation, and consequently, there'll be more rising air and more precipitation in the subtropics above the equator. All right, so next big idea. Climate change impacts regions differently due to both socioeconomic and environmental factors. So, obviously, the impacts of climate change are different based on the region. Some regions will experience drought, some regions will experience flood, etc. So, the environmental impacts are different. But in addition to that, it's also really important to consider the socioeconomic component because obviously certain regions, even if, for example, if two regions experience the same climate change impacts, but one region is much less socioeconomically equipped to handle those impacts, then that's very important to consider. And a foundational idea of the study that I did here was to look at the impacts of climate change and SAI in regions that are socioeconomically perhaps less equipped to handle these consequences of climate change. So you'll see in the red arrows, I looked at 4 different regions. So I looked at South Central America, West Africa, South Asia, and East Asia. And I chose these regions, number one, because in the past several years they've experienced several impacts of climate change, terrible heat waves, flooding, hurricanes, etc. But also, I chose these regions due to socioeconomic components. For example, here we can see these are comparisons of current or near current population versus the projected population in 2070. And the big ideas from this table here are that in 3 out of the 4 regions, so in South Asia, South Central America, and West Africa, we can see that the percentage change in population is quite large, particularly for West Africa, over 100% increase. So they'll be projected to be a population increase of over 100%. In East Asia, there is a decrease, but East Asia, even in 2070, still represents 12.8, is projected to represent 12.8% of the world population. So there's a lot of people, and the more people there are, obviously, the more important it is to consider, okay, how will climate change and SAI, how could these climate futures impact all these people? And obviously, in many of these regions, there's a large reliance on climate for subsistence, for example, for doing subsistence agriculture. There's governmental instability. So it's really important to look at these regions, how climate change and SAI could impact these regions specifically. All right, so I'm going to, obviously, this is a Phytobiomes Alliance talk, so I will be focusing primarily on crop productivity, but I'll be doing so from a holistic sense. So the next big idea that I have up here is important factors in crop productivity include, and include is a very crucial word here because obviously there are many more factors that can contribute from a climate sense to crop productivity. But these are the most important factors that I found in my study and also that I found in the literature. So the important factors in crop productivity include heat stress, CO2 fertilization, and soil moisture slash precipitation. All right. So under various climate change scenarios, crop productivity is projected to decline. That is mostly due to the effect of heat stress. As temperatures rise, crops have a much harder time thriving and producing food. Depending on the type of crop, which I will discuss shortly, some crops benefit more from more CO2, so greater CO2 correlates to greater ability to do photosynthesis and more crop productivity. But in general, it's been found that under various climate change scenarios, the effect of heat stress, the detrimental effect of heat stress, is greater than the positive effect of CO2 fertilization. And then under SAI scenarios, overall, there's been found to be crop productivity increases because precipitation is generally maintained, although it greatly depends on the region, and CO2 fertilization, because it's crucial to understand that under an SAI scenario, temperatures would be cooled because some of incoming sunlight is reflected away from the earth, but CO2 levels are not reduced. And so there's CO2 fertilization effect, there's reduced heat stress because temperatures reduce, and then if precipitation is maintained, then that is projected to result in a crop productivity increase. All right. So I'm going to show, again, I mentioned there's a lot of panels and things going on in these figures, but I'm going to direct your attention to the most important components. All right, so the next big idea is that extreme heat is reduced under SAI in these regions relative to climate change. All right, so what I'm looking at here is the change. So we're comparing the 2050 to 2069 period relative to the 2020 to 2039 period. All right, so this is the change in the maximum annual temperature. So this is an indicator of extreme heat. So think in a given year for a given place, the highest temperature that that place experiences. All right, so we can see, so again, I'm gonna kind of direct your attention to the most important elements. So let's look here at the top row. So this is the climate change scenario. We can see that all the regions are quite red, that the maximum annual temperature under the climate change scenario is significantly higher than the maximum annual temperature in the present day. And then we can see, for example, if we look at the bottom row here, if we look at the cooling scenario, so we used SAI to cool the planet, we can see mostly blue. So we can see that the maximum annual temperature decreases. And so I did another indicator of extreme heat in my research in my paper, but overall we can find that extreme heat does decline under SAI, which would be beneficial for crop productivity. All right, next next big idea. SAI maintains or enhances wet season precipitation and soil moisture in these regions, I emphasize in these regions, relative to climate change. All right, so here we have, so if I go back here briefly, we can see that among all four regions here, we see that the tendencies are pretty much the same under all four regions, right? We can see that the climate change scenario, there's an increase in extreme heat, and under the extreme cooling scenario, we see a decrease in extreme heat. We can see that each region is pretty much similar. But here, as I said before, the precipitation impacts under these different climate futures are much more variable regionally, from region to region. All right, so let's look at the top row here. Let's look at the climate change scenario. We can see that under two of these regions, so in South Asia and in East Asia, wet season, wet season precipitation, I'm defining as precipitation that's accumulated from May through October. Because what's interesting about all four of these regions is that all four of these regions have clear wet and dry seasons within the year. So I'm focusing on the wettest 6 months of the year when these regions receive the vast majority of their moisture and their precipitation for that year. All right, so we can see that for South and East Asia, we can see that that there's not a very large change in the precipitation in the future compared to the present day under the climate change scenario. In contrast, if we look here at South Central America and West Africa, we can see that there are large areas that experience drying. So that these regions are much drier under the climate change scenario than they are compared to the present day. And then if we go down here to the extreme SAI cooling scenario, we can see, again, not a huge change in East Asia and South Asia compared to the present day. But if we look here at South Central America and West Africa, we can see that overall there's an increase in precipitation. So therefore, we can see that, for example, in South Central America and West Africa, SAI could potentially be beneficial in terms of increasing wet season precipitation relative to the climate change scenario. All right, this figure is the same idea, looking at different the tendencies of the different climate futures, but this is looking at the percent change in soil moisture. Soil moisture is a consequence of many different factors. It's notably dependent on precipitation and on temperature. But in this case, what I found both from reading the literature and what I found specifically in this research was that for these regions, precipitation is highly correlated with soil moisture. So, for example, if we look at the top row here, the climate change scenario, we can see that in South Asia and East Asia, there's not too much change in in soil moisture because if we go back here briefly, we can see that there wasn't much change in precipitation, so that makes sense. But if we compare here, if we look at South Central America and West Africa, we can see large decreases in soil moisture due to the decreases in the wet season precipitation under climate change. Okay, and then if we go down here to the SAI 1.0, the largest cooling scenario, we can see that all four of these regions overall experience increases in soil moisture. So basically, under an SAI scenario, there would be decreased heat stress, so that would be beneficial for crop productivity. There would be relatively high levels of CO2 because SAI does not directly impact the atmospheric CO2 concentration, so that would also generally be beneficial for plants and crops. And then number three, we can see that under the SAI scenario, we can see increases in wet season precipitation and in soil moisture relative to the climate change scenario. So all three of these factors would be beneficial to crop productivity. Again, this is a model. This is a very high level general sense, but that's what the main factors in this paper. And then there's one additional factor that's important to that I considered to understand the results that I found in this research is this is kind of a summary of what I've said in the preceding slides. I'm not going to spend too much time on this specific figure. This is the percent change in the total crop yields that are simulated. So if I direct your attention to here, so this top row again is the climate change scenario. So how crop yields would change in the climate change scenario relative to the present day. We can see that, for example, if I direct your attention to South Central America and West Africa, we can see that that there are several areas where we have the brown here, so there's a decrease in crop yields. And then if we compare these two panels right here to these bottom two panels right here, so these are the projected total crop yields under the most extreme SAI cooling scenario, we can see that we can see quite a difference. So we can see that in South Central America and West Africa, overall, there are increases in total crop yields. I've done a lot of emphasis on the top row and the bottom row, so the climate change scenario and the most extreme cooling scenario, because I think that's the easiest way to understand kind of the two extremes. But I'll briefly point out that these two intermediate scenarios, so SAI 1.5 and SAI delayed, the idea of these scenarios is to basically maintain the climate as it is in the present day. And we can see effectively that under SAI 1.5 and SAI delayed, there are relatively modest changes in extreme heat, in precipitation, in soil moisture, in crop productivity, etc. So I've done a lot of emphasis on kind of seeing the extreme changes because I think that's rather clear, but that's also important to keep in mind that the SAI scenarios in which we want to keep things the same effectively do keep these different factors more or less the same. All right, so the final factor to understand the impacts of crop productivity in these different regions is the crop type. So we have C3 plants and C4 plants. To those in atmospheric science that are watching this, in a very simple sense, the C3 plants, they open their stomata, so these openings on their leaves. C3 plants open their stomata more than C4 plants in order to do photosynthesis. There's benefits and drawbacks to each type of plant. So C3 plants, for example, rice and wheat, so they open their stomata a relatively large amount to undergo photosynthesis. And the benefit of that is for example, if there's CO2 fertilization, if there's higher CO2 levels in the atmosphere, they benefit more from that because they have more CO2. But if they open their stomata more, that means they lose more water. So that's very detrimental in situations of heat and drought. On the other hand, C4 plants, for example, corn, they were adapted to live under drier, hotter conditions. So they don't have to open their stomata as much to do photosynthesis. And so the benefit of that is they lose less water, but the drawback of that, particularly under climate change, it's generally been found that C3 plants tend to do better in a very general sense, tend to do better under climate change because of the CO2 fertilization effect, whereas C4 plants don't get to benefit from that CO2 fertilization effect as much. And that's what I found in my research. Here's a paper, Fan et al. 2021, which looked at agriculture simulated under various stratospheric aerosol injection and other geoengineering scenarios and found a similar conclusion. All right, so I'm going to direct your attention to this figure here. So the leftmost two columns, you see South Asia and East Asia. We see, so here in this figure, I focused on one crop, one simulated crop in particular. So for South and East Asia, I focused on rice due to the importance of rice for these regions. And then for South Central America and West Africa, where corn is a very important staple, I focused on how corn yields would change. All right, so we can see that in the top row here under the climate change scenario, we can see that for South Asia and East Asia, there are generally increases in rice yields. And we can see under SAI, under the most extreme cooling scenario, we can see even greater increases. But for example, in the climate change scenario, we can see that in South Central America and West Africa, corn yields decrease significantly due to all the factors that I've mentioned, due to reduced wet season precipitation, reduced soil moisture, greater heat stress, and the fact that corn is a C4 plant and therefore can't benefit as much from the C2 fertilization. And then if we look here at the bottom here, so how corn yields would change for these two regions under SAI 1.0. Under the most extreme cooling scenario, we can see that corn yields still don't increase greatly because they can't benefit as much from CO2 fertilization as the C3 crops, such as rice. But there's the generally increases in yields, or yields stay about the same. Certainly there's more corn in the cooling scenario relative to the climate change scenario. All right, so one final figure that I will show you. This figure is basically a synthesis of everything that I've presented so far. So if we look at the legend here, so I'm looking at how under these different climate futures, what would the percent change in crop yields be for each of the four crops? So we have rice, wheat, tropical corn, and tropical soybean, how they would change for each region under the different climate scenarios. All right, so from a very simple sense, if we compare the top panels here, so South Asia and East Asia, we can see that overall, with few exceptions, for all the crops under all the different climate scenarios, crop yields increase. Whereas if we look here at South Central America, and particularly for West Africa, we can see that crop yields tend to decrease. One exception, you'll see here the red bars are tropical soybean. If I go back to this paper right here, Fan et al. 2021, they explain that in this model, there are so soybean, this result is biased. It's soybean is projected to increase more than it actually would. There are certain physiological processes that would prevent this that are not incorporated into the model. So that's why soybean yields increases and yields are so high here. But we can see, for example, if we look at the yields in the different regions, we can see that in general for South and East Asia, we have increases in yields for almost all crops and almost all scenarios. And for South Central America and West Africa, we see overall decreases in yields. All right, so here I'm at my final conclusion slide. So the main idea of all these main ideas that I presented, the main idea that I'd like you to take away from this presentation is that SAI could decrease food security issues caused by climate change, and I will nuance this. In these particular scenarios, in this model, for these particular regions, this is what was found. It's very important to keep in mind that these results are highly dependent on the scenario. As I was explaining before, no one SAI or climate change scenario exists. So that's very important to keep in mind. From model to model, I just used one model um, in this study, but model to model differences are also very important to consider. In different regions, the findings that I could obtain could also be very different. But with all of that qualified, under SAI for this study, there's increased wet season precipitation, there's increased soil moisture, and decreased heat stress relative to the climate change scenario. The extent depends on the scenario. So we saw that in general, the SAI scenarios for which we want to keep the global mean temperature more or less the same, more or less keeps precipitation, soil moisture, et cetera, more the same. And then for the extreme cooling scenario, we saw an increase in wet season precipitation, in soil moisture, and a reduction of heat extremes relative to the climate scenario. And then finally, we saw that the effect um, is larger in South Central America and West Africa relative to South and East Asia. So, under these scenarios, we find that South Central America and West Africa could benefit more greatly from SAI than South and East Asia, although all these regions, from a crop productivity sense, um, could benefit from SAI relative to climate change. There's definitely a need for further research. I will say to conclude that this study is looking at crop productivity. It is not looking at crop nutrition, which is another factor because even if there's greater yields, if the nutrition level of the crop is lower, then that's also a very important factor to consider. Again, there are many different areas that could be explored, different regions, different scenarios, different models, etc. But this study was just one example of looking at how different climate futures using Earth system models, understanding holistically how climate could be impacted and how human welfare could be impacted under these different models. So that was my presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me today, and I am more than happy to accept whatever questions you have. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Sabrina. That was very interesting and an excellent presentation. We do have a number of questions coming in, but I thought I might get started with a question myself while everyone's typing in the questions panel. So, I mean, you mentioned that there are a number of different ways or a number of different areas that further research is needed. But are you yourself taking this research
Mm,
to another level in your PhD, or what do you see the next steps to be?
mm. That is a good question. The project that I'm currently working on for my PhD does not have a direct relationship to crop productivity under climate futures. I'm not sure at this point whether I will, although I do think that greater research is needed. Um, I think that there are many different avenues that could be explored. I think mostly I'd say that the two areas that I think are definitely opportunities for development. I believe I've mentioned both of them. One is looking at different models and different scenarios because it's important to understand that, okay, if we find some results in a certain scenario and we don't find them in a different scenario, then it's important to keep that in mind. I would like to also, an idea that I had in mind is if I for example, the precipitation changes that I showed, under climate change, there's a large decrease in precipitation in the subtropics. And so I think it would be really interesting. So South Central America and West Africa are subtropical
Mm,
areas. So I would be really interested to see if similar projected changes in crop productivity are also the same in other subtropical regions, seeing if there's a regional coherence in that sense. So.
mhm. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, I'll jump to the audience questions. So the first one is, how does SAI injection work from a practical standpoint? Is it economical and practical from
Mm.
existing technology?
Very good question. Thank you so much. SAI, it works by taking airplanes, injecting a bunch of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, into the high atmosphere, and chemical process. processes result in the conversion of that sulfur dioxide into sulfate aerosols, so little particles that can reflect sunlight. Whether it is economical and practical are all extremely, extremely good questions. Economical, I would say the general consensus is yes. There are actually, I didn't have the chance to explore that in this particular talk, but besides SAI, there are other geoengineering processes that are being considered, changing how clouds reflect sunlight, et cetera, et cetera. But SAI has been found to be by far the most economical, so the most feasible from an economical perspective. Now, whether it's practical, that is a very economic considerations aside, I think that's a very important area, and I can't respond with the same confidence. There's a lot of work, if you're interested, there's a lot of work that's been done and that's being done on how SAI could be governed, right? Because how would different nations, would there be a lot of conflict? Because some nations, for example, would want more cooling, other nations would want less cooling. And so, would the world be able to collaborate in a way that SAI could be sustained? That is a big question. I unfortunately don't have the answer to that, but that's an extremely important consideration to keep in mind.
Carrying on that point, the next question is about carrying it out
Mhm.
to get the impacts described. Is it a one-time injection, or does
Mhm.
this need to be repeated over a long period of time?
Very good. Thank you so much for the clarification. Yes. So SAI would, in this model, I'll repeat, in this model, injection begins in 2035, and unfortunately, it's not a one-time injection. It would need to be sustained um, in this model, injection occurs from 2035 or 2045 to 2069. So it's a several decade um, process. And I will say as well, one drawback of this particular simulation is that to maintain temperatures at a certain level or to cool temperatures, injection would not automatically stop at 2069. It would likely require several more decades of injection. So that is one factor to consider. Unfortunately, it would require a really sustained effort. And that's also where the governmental considerations are very important because if for example, if SAI were implemented and then due to conflict between nations, it was suddenly stopped, that could have potential very severe consequences on the climate as well. And so, yes, that is an extremely important consideration to keep in mind. It would require a very sustained effort.
Okay, thank you. Um, Another question, slightly different from the one that I asked. If you were to continue to do this work, are there any other data sources that could be included that would improve the modeling?
Mm, very good question. I think what I would like to do in terms of data sources is so there's a report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the basically the authority on every couple years for the past several decades. They've released a report that's basically a compendium. It's a summary of everything that's been researched in terms of the impacts of climate change. And so for these reports to understand how, for example, how climate change could impact the climate in the future, there is a heavy dependence on these Earth system models. So the model that I've used for this study is just one of many, many, many models. And so a lot of studies in order to understand, okay, under different models, how would the situation change? So if I were to do a study, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take many of these models and compare, okay, crop productivity under this model, what happens? Crop productivity under that model, what happens? Is there agreement between the models, or do the models produce drastically different results? Because if a lot of different models produce similar results, then I could have more confidence than that might be what would occur under different climates.
Okay, thank you. So next question is, would SAI cause acid rain?
Mm. Yes, I do believe so. it would cause because of the injection of sulfur dioxide. That is, I am afraid I don't have a specific reference in mind. But from reading, I remember the general consensus is that yes, from a chemical perspective, that would inevitably cause acid rain. But if I remember correctly, the scale, the extent to which acid rain would be caused would be in a controllable extent. It wouldn't be uh, disastrous. However, I'd be more than happy to do some further reading and send you some links if you'd like.
Hey, you've mentioned it in your presentation that there are, different alternatives than the SAI injection. So, for a long time we were talking about planting more trees globally.
Mm.
Is there any information that compares all of these alternatives and then also, takes into the practical and economic um, aspects in that comparison?
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't have a whole lot of time to get into all the different possible geoengineering approaches. But basically, there are two types of approaches that are considered. Um, One is called carbon dioxide removal. So it's literally removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that the CO2 concentrations are lowered. So the benefit of that is that it addresses the root cause of climate change. But unfortunately, the drawback of that is that unfortunately, there still hasn't been found it's very expensive. It's not very efficient. The technology to do so on a global scale that would cause a really big impact. And then the other major category of these different geoengineering approaches is referred to as solar geoengineering. Solar being the idea is SAI is a type of solar engineering. The idea is that CO2 concentrations are not changed. What has changed is that some of incoming sunlight is reflected in order to cool the planet. And there are other, besides SAI, there's been a lot of emphasis on SAI in the literature because it's found to be the most economically feasible. But there are several different approaches. For example, there's cirrus cloud thinning, there's marine cloud brightening, basically influencing clouds so that they reflect more sunlight. There's a National Academy of Sciences report, which compiles very nicely kind of the different options and their different drawbacks and advantages. I can find the specific report and send it to you if you're interested.
Hey, that'd be great. Okay, last and probably final question that we have time for is all things considered, with adequate funding and agreement that this makes sense, what is a reasonable time frame for this project to be implemented on a commercial scale?
A reasonable time frame. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I'll just clarify. From what I hear basically is what would be the time frame, what would be the optimal time frame to implement SAI? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Um, I would say, to be very honest, the sooner the better. The sooner the better. Because the longer we wait, there's been literature done on the subject. For example, I don't know if you're watching this, Daniel, but I'll reference your paper. There was a paper in Nature Communications that found that, for example, if we wait to implement SAI until 2045, then we would have to cool global temperatures really fast, right? Because by 2045, temperatures will be quite high, and that could have a really detrimental impact on different animal species because they can't adjust to, for example, if there's really rapid rates of warming, and then there's sudden cooling from a natural sense that's very unnatural. That would have a detrimental impact. So I guess the short answer I have is the sooner the better if we were to implement this.
Mhm. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Sabrina. We are at the top of the hour, and thank you for all of our participants. This has been an excellent discussion and clearly a topic that impacts uh, the phytobiomes. So thank you so much, and let's all come back here at our next webinar in March and hope to see you very soon. Thanks, Sabrina. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.